Indylive.Radio.
This week, the spotlight is on Edinburgh's Yes Hub, who hosted an evening with Lesley Riddoch, and there was a very wide-ranging discussion which started off on land reform and ended up with the importance of jumping on a moving horse and lots of other things in between. So hope you enjoyed this, and thanks very much to Edinburgh Yes Hub for letting us share it with you.
I mean, this is a classic Mike Blackshaw sort of job, you know, like he got in touch and said, can you be doing something next weekend? And I said, not really. And I said, but I could do tomorrow. And he went, right, great. So
how much I love you that it cancelled somebody from Spain just to have you on.
Well, you said you wanted me to talk about community buyouts and so on, but I mean, you know, it's a democratic meeting here. I don't know if that's what everybody wants to talk about or.
Yes, I'd really love to hear about the land reform stuff. That's all.
Tim.
Okay, right. Well, okay.
We'd like to hear about taxes on land.
Okay, that's enough people that generally want something vaguely about land reform. So I think, you know, I could kind of do a bit about that, and the kind of community buyouts that we're in at the moment. I mean, it's just to say, first of all, that I mean, I was involved for 8 years with the Isle of Egg Trust during its lead up to its community buyout, and it would have to be said they were the most enjoyable, sociable, quite drunken, kind of friendly, inspiring days of my life, practically, because as I was saying at that demonstration, Morag, what Scots have really internalised is that kind of, you know, is the product of hundreds of years of feudalism. And that sounds, you know, a bit esoteric, but what it means is you know that you are never in charge, you never own anything, certainly, definitely. There's nothing that's unequivocally, certainly, securely yours. And I mean, out of that, Scots have built quite an allergy to the idea of ownership, actually. But sometimes that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because nations that just casually have, I mean, you know, ownership of land is not necessarily a dirty word. It's what gives people something that, you know, something from which they cannot be pushed further. It's what meant for Norway that even when they became independent in 1905 and instantly became the second poorest country in Europe, with periods where, I mean, they don't produce enough food to feed themselves, given their latitude. So there was long periods after the First World War where they were nearly starving. So this question of equal access to land was not just some sort of esoteric abstraction. Not only did it mean things like just how the country progressed, it meant actually that Norway has become one of the most vibrant democracies in the world because so many people owned land. And I mean, if people think about it, every country has the same factors in its origin, which is that people got the right to vote because they were male usually, and they owned land. So the more people that owned land, the wider the democracy you had early doors. And the wider that democracy, you know, inevitably, the different kind of country you got. And you actually could not have a greater contrast between Norway and Scotland. In 1814, when the Norwegians thought they were going to be independent for a while, they wrote a constitution that gave the vote to every man over the age of 25 that owned land. And so many men owned land that 45% of that group got the vote overnight in 1814. Now, you'd better believe that single moment transformed Norway, because there was nowhere except revolutionary France that had a wider electorate, and they had got there by not very pleasant means. So this was a democratic thing. That parliament was swiftly dismissed by the British as the peasants' parliament, and actually, funnily enough, owned by the Norwegians quite proudly as the peasants' parliament, which tells you something. And that peasants' parliament went on to abolish nobility in 1827. Still think we should have a little round of applause for that, actually, because, you know, there's one we could all learn from. There are 37 dukes in Britain, and all of them own land in Scotland. So there's how slow the peasants were. The next thing, they put through a Municipalities Act, which meant that they would not be ruled by Oslo. So basically, Norway would become a self-governing country of self-governing municipalities, which has kept the money local, the power local, and the empowerment levels really high. So, at the moment, 1 in 88 Norwegians stands for election. In Scotland, 1 in 2,071 stands for election. So this is what all of this comes from, owning land, because that's what gave you the capacity to vote, and that's what shaped the kind of people who got in to the parliament. In 1832, that same condition, which had produced 45% of guys owning the land in 1814 in Norway, that same thing, men over the age of 25 owning land, in the so-called Great Reform Act, enfranchised 5% of men across the UK, and in Scotland, a shameful 2.8%. Right. So that's how important this has been in shaping us, because basically, the landowning elite created a democratic elite. It could do no other. And other people did not have that experience. So this is the legacy we have inherited, and what we're kind of, what we're throwing at it, instead of dismantling the underlying conditions of it, what's happening really is community buyouts. Now, having spent kind of 8 years, in fact, more than that eventually, with the Egachs and the folk in Assynt and various other places, who would say these are not great things to do? I mean, clearly, they've empowered these folk hugely. The change in people is just quite unbelievable. And of course, it demonstrates what we should have already known, which is that the Scots are capable of running themselves. Do they have to go through a 10-year buyout to do that? Really? Actually, I don't know. I don't think so. And if you look at successful democracies, none of them are characterized by having community buyouts. Because what happens, what that's all about, and the current vogue for community everythings, is basically saying we have crap systems. If you think you're hard enough, you can get yourself out of it. We're not going to change the whole system. And actually, you can be pretty sure that when you hear the word community, what you're hearing is a crap system that isn't going to be changed. And over time, that's might be my objection to it. On the one hand, of course, I would support any community buyout that's happening, but actually, this is a gigantic piece of distraction from, we cannot buy Scotland out acre by acre. And it leaves you with the sort of ridiculous situations we're in now, where the dear old Duke of Buccleuch is selling, because he feels like it, selling Langham Moor, which is mostly because Langham Moor was one of the biggest grouse moors in Scotland. But that seems to have, let's choose our words carefully here, coincided with the disappearance of quite a lot of hen harriers. So there was a huge, long, very expensive project by SNH to try and establish if having hen harriers was compatible with having a grouse moor. Here's the stunning result. It isn't. So basically, the Duke of Buccleuch looked at his, fondly at his grouse moor, realised the game was now a bogey, and decided to get rid of it, along with a chunk of forest that can only be commercial forestry, 9 houses which can only be houses, unless of course you're planning to chip people out, demolish their houses and create country cottages or something, and all of that comes at the price of £6.4 million. So the latest community buyout effort at Langham Moor is trying got £1 million from the Scottish Land Fund, which was the biggest single payout in the 16 million that they gave to different communities. They could hardly have given more money. And even if they had, they'd have had to have given more than a third of it to one thing to hand straight on to dear old Richard, I think it is. Is that right? It's just not conceivably right at all. And as Andy Whiteman's pointed out, the Scottish government is just wearily seems to be sticking to paying full market value for land, when Andy would prefer them to use the investment value, which would be a lot lower. There's various other ways you could calculate it, which would be lower. And as I think it was Rob McAlpine pointed out, there is, the European law that's often pointed to by landowners to say you can't just confiscate my land, points out that all that has to be true is that the land is taken by a government in the public interest. Well, we could talk about that, and the confiscation has to have fair compensation. It doesn't say market value. So we are allowing this nonsense to keep going on. There's no reason really for the community to buy Lang & Moore, because actually the Duke of Buccleuch can't shoot anything over it now, really. And yet that crumb that falls from his table is the only thing that's come up for sale for a very long time. So this is not okay. And yet it's all that's going to be proposed. And I think Ian, or was it George rather, had some thoughts there about the myriad things that could be done. And this is the point, because an effective democracy doesn't just have one big cudgel. It tends to have, over time, quite a variety of restraints and constraints have emerged over land. We're like a ploughed field that nothing has ever been in before, because we haven't done anything. There's also a tendency in Scotland, I think, to think of one big solution, because we don't have that much experience of having our hands on the tiller, to think that we get more than one shot at it. But actually the best way, I think, to deal with this is to have a number of things going on at the same time. And that's not necessarily the nationalisation of all land. Again, successful countries like Norway have hundreds of thousands of landowners. And I would prefer to see that model than a monolithic sort of nationalised structure of land, although some parts of Norway have been nationalised and it works perfectly well. But for example, you could absolutely levy a proper tax on land. Currently, most of them are not paying any kind of business rates or sporting rates. And although that was levied by the last Land Reform Act, most of them have managed to claim that they are small businesses and have got the small business exemption to not pay those rates. So that's not sticking, yet nobody seems to be returning to deal with it. You could also have what the Danes and the Norwegians have, which is that you can't buy productive land unless you've done 5 years at agricultural college. Now, if the Duke of Buccleuch has got time on his hands and wants to go along to Dumfries College or wherever and do an agricultural course, fair play, But that's an absolute rule, and that would change vast amounts of Buccleuch's territory, because an awful lot of that is productive land. You would have a succession act, which we're told is coming along but never quite seems to get here. And many people might think, I don't care about toffs inheriting land more equally, because at the moment, there's not equal rights to inherit land amongst children. There's equal rights to inherit property, but not land. I wonder why. It used to be, obviously, primogeniture, which was even more unfair, which meant that lawfully, only the eldest son could inherit everything. And that's the way that sporting estates have remained intact for hundreds of years. Primogeniture was got rid of in Scotland. I think it was 1957. The last of any European country to get rid of it. But actually what's happened is that the eldest son is just inheriting, and the other children are just not contesting it, nor can they, because they haven't got the legal right to. So a Succession Act would just say children can inherit land equally, and that would mean that every Toff family would essentially have to divvy things up between 4 or 5 people. And that's the beginning of breakups, which over hundreds of years creates smaller units that can eventually be bought by other people. And as a measure of how blimmin' far behind we are on all of this, the rest of Europe has had equal rights of inheritance of land by children since the Napoleonic Code in 1801. So we are 200 years behind on that. Think about how 200 years of 4 or 5 people, exponentially inheriting land breaks up big estates. I mean, I could go on, but there's plenty of mechanisms that could go in there. And a land value tax as part of local taxation has been suggested by Ranald MacDonald, who's a professor within the Adam Smith School, I think at Edinburgh University, not a radical. He's saying a wealth tax and a land tax are no-brainers. And indeed, they are no-brainers, but they're also too hot to trot, because when they were suggested by the Greens, they were basically battered into touch by the SNP. So we've kind of reached this pretty sair fecht, really, where I'm pretty convinced that the leadership of the SNP think that the bulk of people in Scotland don't care about land reform. They don't care about land ownership. Sure, it's unequal, it's embarrassing, it's the worst in the developed world, yada yada. But I think they think if Andy Whiteman and I got sort of run over by a milk lorry, that would be the end of it. And clearly what happened at their conference a couple of years would rather suggest that's not true. But here we are in the middle of so many, many things: COVID, independence, Boris, Brexit, urgent, massive, destructive things, that it looks very hard to pull a government that's clearly not committed to making any big changes back onto the case for reform. So that's where we are, and I think it's a very unhealthy place, because for everyone who doesn't live in a city and who is aware, very much aware of who owns land, it's telling you that I-Bean can't change. It's telling you that the destructive patterns of centuries can't be changed. And actually, the change is not reliant on independence. Even within cities is a different question, because it's often harder to notice to do with land. But as many of you will know, there are huge bits of cities, we tried to point this out during the Our Land campaign, where land is owned by offshore tax haven companies and just land banked for a very long time, pushing up property prices for everybody. So yeah, we could do a heck of a lot more, and yet that isn't, by the looks of it, it's not going to happen. So in the meantime, support One Lochhead, who are about to become real pioneers in Scotland. They've had a vote last week that was 55% in favour of going ahead, and that looks kind of a bit weak, but actually, given their position right kind of in the southern part of Scotland, and the number of people who are thorold to the old dukedom style of doing things, that's quite a result. But now they have to get it over the line. They have to be able to raise money. They have to get a grant from the land fund, and they have to make a fist of it. So to me, this is as important as egg. It's that important that One Lochhead goes ahead well. So, despite everything I've said, I'm still spending my time trying to make sure that they're able to put their case as well as possible to prove that they can run the place better than the Duke.
I want to move to Norway.
I'll pay your fare, Mary.
I would say, Lesley, one person does pay tax on land in Scotland.
Yes.
And of course, he is Danish and he pays it to the Danish government. That just shows how stupid the system is in this country.
Yeah, I mean, it's not certain I'm not certain Anders Poulsen's paying tax, but it's very probable that he should be paying. He comes from a municipality called Aarhus, and it's very likely that he's paying tax on land that isn't even in Denmark. But that's why these guys come here. And then there's a lot of debate about this, because a lot of people like Anders Poulsen because he wants to rewild. He's less shite fundamentally than a lot of the old hereditary landowners. But he's still one guy who gets to decide everything. And I have had quite a lot of arguments with people about this. I just think that's a distraction myself.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Lesley, because the SNP obviously has no effective opposition at the moment, so they can afford to be sort of very center and not radical and not doing the things that we want them to do. What, in your view, is the significance of the two new independence parties? And have they put forward any ideas on land reform in their platforms? Have they articulated anything that would sort of move us in this direction?
No, they haven't. And there would be, from their point tactically, there would be really little point in doing that, because, I mean, with Andy Whiteman in the Greens, you have the best land reform activist there's ever been, the best researcher, the most thoroughly active guy right at the centre of the Greens party. But obviously when the Greens get a crack of the whip, which is not very often given their size, they've got quite a long list of other stuff that they will see as a priority. And the Greens are trying to cover, a massive number of things. Let's not even get into the gender recognition thing here, but, there's stuff they put as a pretty high priority. And land reform, to be fair, Andy has been trying to kind of snipe his way along, in that the Greens, what Holyrood's about, as far as I can see, really, is that the SNP just produces proposed legislation, and the job of other MSPs is just to look at that and come up with amendments that will be defeated. That's what being an opposition MSP is about. You can get days where you're able to propose stuff, but the likelihood of it coming out the other end is very low. And so Andy's had to try to insert amendments into other legislation. Some of you will know that he tried, just for example, to require any landowner that's gouging a track through pristine land to require planning permission, and that got defeated by the SNP voting with the Tories. There was a lot of minor stuff and some major stuff actually about how land's valued, which was voted down. And each time when that happens, the SNP's argument is that what Andy's proposing is not a sort of holistic, worked through solution. Well, it can't be, because the Greens don't get to do that kind of proposing within Holyrood. So we're stuck with this. And I've got to say, there's my mother's lot come from Caithness, and that family was cleared. So that probably put me on this thing to start off with. And then being interested in all the Nordics lets you see what different society you get when you start off with fundamental fairness. So that really built it in. So I've got to the stage of thinking, well, it could be worth setting a party up that is just about repopulating, particularly the Highlands, repopulating the rural areas, land reform. That would be all it would be. Obviously, it would have positions and everything else. But now we've come to this position where, already we've got the pro-independence vote on the list potentially being split 4 ways. And, if Wings decides to throw in, there's 5. It's not, now is not the time to be chucking any more variations on the theme in there, We're stuck at the moment with this sort of logjam, and creative, normal politics that we should have is very hard to do while we've got this constant, almost independence kind of stage.
Lesley, I want to ask a question here. You said it's got nothing to do with independence, but for me, not solving the constitutional issue is a massive break on democracy. And I think you're almost hinting at the fact that we've got to get it out of the way, and then we would be able to address the issue. What do you feel about that?
I am such a massive opponent of later as a philosophy. It might have come from having a mother who tended, God bless her, tended to be a bit more of a later girl, and it made me a bit of a now sort of person. But all these things that sound too difficult, what is all this about? Let's just take the COVID example. I mean, how that seems to have shifted things is by a real life, actual thing happening that's massively important, and has been done with principles of apart from the original cock-up with the elderly people, but latterly when the lessons have been learnt from that, and I know people might argue they still haven't been properly, but has at least compared to England, let's say, conduct of governance here has been done with equity, with sort of compassion, with good communication and so on. And that has shifted the poles. Now, I just think that if we were to say that we're really going to become a modern country, and that's what the offer is, if you want to stay stuck in an archaic, backward-facing, the only people that even use first past the post, the only people who think that some set of old Etonians are worthy of running the country, everything about Britain just creaks. And it creaks because way back when, let's just go back to those statistics again, only 2.8% of guys had the vote. That's the period that we're being brought back to all the time as the halcyon days of Britain. watch the upstairs, downstairs, watch Downton Abbey, watch the whole 9 yards. And what you're brought back to all the time is a time of crippling poverty and inequality as Britain's finest hour. Now, to me, what the whole thing, I'm not a sort of flag waver. I'm not that kind of nationalist. I'm someone who sees that Scotland has been voting differently for 100 years. It's voting to be a social democracy. And that means things. It doesn't just sort of mean not Boris. It means positive things, like recognising immediately when you are the most unfair and unequal country in the European Union, because we pretty much are. So, it's true that the kind of jump in everyone's consciousness that would be needed to become independent would provide such a kind of boost of energy that I'm sure we would begin to go through all sorts of other things too. A bit like, the Black Lives Matter thing started all the statue protests, and suddenly things that you couldn't have said the previous week, you're not just able to say, you're knocking the blooming statue down that has it on it. So, when things begin to shift, they do shift, for sure. But I just don't see, to me, the stuckness of Scottish society that we never talk about because it doesn't help our cause. That stuckness that we all know exists is sitting there in people's minds when it comes to having confidence in a future where we run the country. So I just always feel that these things should be tackled. I don't think it would be so difficult.
Thanks, Lesley. Thank you very much for that.
You made the point there about later. And you're absolutely right. It's now. It's 9 months until the Scottish elections. How are we going to get the movement back together again?
Well, first of all, I don't know. Just in case anybody thinks I do know, I don't know. Right? But I wrote a piece in the National saying it would be good if we could get the larger component bits of the independence movement together to sort of create a yes campaign 2. I don't know why that has proved impossible, actually. But there are certain large-ish groups who already pretty much, they don't think they are the Yes campaign, but they're already sort of big enough that they're doing their own thing. And I don't think they think that it would, well, let's just, in Commonweal, obviously, have got their plan. They're working methodically through that. You could have arguments about aspects of it. You might find yourself talking to the hand a bit because I think it's a standalone, it's an all or nothing kind of plan. And I don't think they get easily deflected into thinking that there's another way to put their energies at the moment that's any better than what they're doing. Business for Scotland, they're kind of thumping along at the moment too. And I think Gordon McIntyre-Kemp feels that pretty much they're probably the best vehicle because he's raised loads of money, he's employed 6 people, they're thumping out their wee booklets. I've said to him, okay, that's fine, but it's not very democratic, is it? Because it's basically you running it, which went down like a bit of a lead balloon at the time. But he said, well, let's have a sort of advisory group then. But fundamentally, this is the way this thing has got working, and everything that's been more democratic, like the Scottish Independence Convention, has kind of gone slightly round in circles and been difficult to move in a lithe way because it has a huge set of people to have to refer to and consult. And the Scottish Independence Convention itself, I don't know because I'm not on it anymore. I resigned 2 years ago or something because it just wasn't active enough for me. And I went off and did the films that I did in the Nordic countries instead, which just felt more productive, really, better use of time. But I'm not conscious of them having fought their way out of that sort of stuckness. I think they also, they put a bit of money into changing their logo and stuff like that. I don't know that people felt that was just the best use of money. So there's an awful lot of sort of candidate things sitting around. Meanwhile, did you have George Kerrigan on recently? But anyway, George was talking about having some sort of convention, and that was something that he was talking to the Scottish Independence Foundation guys about, but that hasn't come out the other end either. So I think the basic problem is that people who have no structure look at now the huge sort of almost unwieldy nature of the reality of what we've got, which is we've got a little bit of the independence movement everywhere. We haven't got all of it somewhere. And all of it somewhere is the classic idea of how movements occur. Actually, a little bit somewhere is how societies change. So, although I would quite like to see something that would be, and not with all the money sitting at the top, but my hope had always been that the Yes groups would create regional groups, which actually many have, has just naturally been happening, and that they would just go the last mile and just create a national federation structure. Don't put any money into it, don't buy headquarters, don't get carried away, but that just gives you skin in the game. That to me is the most grounded democratic structure that's not liable to be captured by personalities or previous agendas. But the Yes groups find that incredibly daunting. Most Yes groups find just keeping their own stalls going quite sort of nerve-wracking. And the regional things, some of them work, some of them don't work. But I think the problem is anybody else who comes along trying to sort of create something is creating a sort of artificial thing that isn't of the grassroots. And it's just, the trouble is, it's doing what's always happened in Scotland, which is a top-down thing. And much as some people obviously don't care much about that, because nearly everywhere, I often go to stuff and people say, Lesley, it's so sweet that people would think this, but they say, Lesley, would you lead this thing? And I just think, Jesus, listen to yourselves. You need to lead this. The day that this country will change is when you don't come to some pre-existing, overeducated, mouthy woman like me. I mean, I know that is tempting, and I can go on till the end of time, as you can see. I went to Oxford, I worked for the BBC, I am not scared of these people, and I can hold my own there. But the point is, I'm already on. You don't need to superannuate me. They quite like me, I fit the bill. That's not democracy. Democracy, the thing that scares the shit out of people is when the people get organised, and when they put their own people forward and they don't draft in folk who just look like they can hold their own in a wee parlour setting. So I am still sitting hopeful that is going to find its way to fruition at some point, because basically the sort of great and the good, such as they are, of the independence movement have not been able to do that.
I do agree with you completely. And it is a struggle. It is actually a real struggle. I'm a convener of a small Yes group, and I'm trying to get a regional group going. And it's not easy, and it all takes time and energy.
Yeah.
But I certainly agree fully with that model. I would like to see that put in place, definitely.
Having just done stuff in Edinburgh, and that just collapsed through, just impossible to get people to help out. It was just struggling. People were just basically only willing to turn up and to events and not actually get involved with the running. It seems to be more of an Edinburgh thing than it does seem to be a Scotland thing, because you seem to get an awful lot more activity elsewhere. But I've seen it in other groups in Edinburgh, where it's a very small core group of people in any group, and trying to get more people involved is difficult, extremely difficult.
Those polls showed something like 72%, was it, of 30s and under would vote yes. Well, where are they all?
Well, exactly. There's an awful lot of people who are willing to support it. It's getting involved on doing things on the streets and then everywhere else. Most people like to say things online. It's not the actual getting down and doing the real work is where the problem lies.
Right. Well, I'd just like to agree with what Leslie's saying there about Norway and the kind of the concept of dugnad, which is so, which you probably have heard about. This idea of community cooperation and doing something for the community, and I call it the legacy of powerlessness. That Scots have been so powerless for so long in any effective way that they have lacked that ability to have the confidence to come together, to cooperate, and also to cooperate willingly and cheerfully without necessarily electing a leader. People just act, I'll do this, I can do that, right? And people just have a kind of talent for just falling together in Norway, which in Scotland it's the complete opposite. It's like herding sheep, herding
cats,
hens or something like that. It really is. And particularly there's this kind of thing about leadership, who are you just being so bossy, it's this whole idea of I mean, I remember an expression I heard from my grandfather about somebody strutting about. Well, does he think he is strutting about like Lord Duke of Buccleuch? You know, it's somebody who gets above himself. But it just shows how that kind of feudal mentality of both resentment against the kind of feudal elite, but also a kind of inability to have the confidence in yourself and in your peers to be able to actually cooperate without necessarily thinking that somebody's throwing their weight around. So
the confidence issue, definitely.
Yeah.
The thing is, the confidence thing, I mean, I sort of took quite exception to the kind of approach that Carol Craig had about confidence, because I don't think the confidence thing is a sort of, if you just realise you've got a confidence problem, you can kind of eradicate it. Because, and perhaps I'm being unfair to Carol, I'm sure she's got more complex thoughts about its origins as well. But to me, confidence is a kind of utterly predictable outcome of structures. It's sort of, it sounds a bit boring, but I mean, really, if you have a situation where, I think it was 1870, 2.9% of Scots owned any land at all. What that means is you never knew if you were about to be evicted. And actually, guys who were on the land for 6 months were regarded as long-term lets. Hundreds of thousands of men never lived with their families because there was no land for cottages in this empty country. So they spent their entire lives living in the bothies with the single men, with their families living in nearby villages, until they just left the land altogether and then went to even worse deals, basically, because basically the powers that be knew they'd nowhere to go back to, unlike Norway, where they owned land at the same time as being urban dwellers and factory owners. They could still factory workers. There was always somewhere to go back to, and in Scotland there was nowhere to go back to. So I think people sort of think, yeah, you're laying this on a bit thick, and yeah, the clearances are pretty shit, but I mean, it was ancient history. That was like hundreds of years ago. It's a nanosecond. It's 3 conversations across the generations. You know, there were women being bondagers in the lowlands of Scotland around the Lothians who were contracted and had to work without pay as a system of agricultural working. They were raped, they were scared, and they lived like that until the Second World War. So the thing is, let's just get how much we've got a big zip going right down the back of our heads, and anybody that manages to get over it is doing like the egg acts, watching them stumblingly getting to the stage of realising that nobody could make a worse cock up of egg than the previous landowners, that they had to give it a go. It was like, I wrote a book, Blossom, after that. That's what it was like. It was like seeing Scotland blossom. Sure, it is just confidence, but the confidence is so umbilically linked to the conditions that we are not changing. You know, so all the circumstances that create a lack of confidence are just being allowed to keep reproducing that virus, really. So it's a difficult one. As long as we have massive local councils that is there anybody here a councillor? You guys have all self-selected as being pretty keen to come on a Friday night and think this is the best way to spend your time, eh? So, you know, if you're in any other country, half of you would be councillors, but you won't be here because we have the largest local council units in the developed world, which once again, everyone goes, yeah, it's almost like that's, you know, not that argument. So all these things create a lack of confidence because we haven't had enough shots at running things.
Lesley, it's inbred, definitely.
Well, it's not inbred, I think, you know, because that's to imply that it's within us. It's within the structures that keep reproducing the insecurity. And the thing is, if you live in a situation, look, most of you will have bairns. If you say to a bairn, you know, can you cycle? And you don't let the bairn ever try and get on a bike, can they cycle? You've got to get to a stage where people are able to exercise control of things. That's what brings confidence. And the really clear aspect of Scottish society is that you don't get to exercise power unless you are the Duke of Buccleuch or now, you know, elected to the Scottish Parliament. And even then, actual real power in the Scottish Parliament lives in one political party. You know, that's why I go on and on about this, because the solution to all of this, and I mean, I had a mum, she used to say the best left. And that was a Highland view, that, you know, the best people left when they saw how unfair the clearances were and how life would always be. They got their heads screwed on and they got on the boats and they went. And they left the rump. And the conclusion of that is that we are the descendants of the rump who didn't have the courage to leave. And that was my mother's view growing up. So what I think now is it's exactly the opposite. Because if you went to any of these countries where Scots went and set up much better systems of governance, albeit they were equally unfair to the Indigenous people, but they set up equal systems of government for themselves and didn't reproduce the country they just left. Well, actually, it's quite easy to live in those countries. If you want to change something, you just vote. It works. Whereas the difficult place to live is Scotland, and yet we're all still here. And look at us, God love us. We're all sitting here on a Friday night making common cause with folk we don't really know, because we're absolutely determined to fix this place. And we know how hard it is. So actually, the best didn't leave. The best are sitting here. And I think we have to just make sure that at the one moment we recognise what things are holding us back and name them and fix them, ideally. But we don't believe that things are inherent in us, because that's just not true. You know, when we're talking about this question of it being so hard to self-organise, where was the Labour Party set up? Where did Keir Hardie come from? You know, where's the trade union movement begin? It's all Scotland.
And grassroots Scotland at that.
Lesley, the first time we met, I told you the story of being during the war, brought up in Aberdeenshire, my grandparents. And one day I said to my granny, I can't do that. And she said, Ian, sell your canna, buy a can. And I think that's the philosophy we need now.
Well, so the thing is, this is why I keep coming back to this. The business of yes groups, somehow getting to the stage where you guys feel empowered and sort of able and responsible to set something up, would be the day when a lot of things have changed in Scotland. You know, there's that saying that Scotland will have changed. What is it, when the last minister of the Church of Scotland dives into the sea clutching a molasses copy of the Sunday Post rolled between his teeth? That would be a bit of a day right enough. But actually, that's just the exit of things. The presence of things is more what I'm interested in. And, you know, the presence of a grassroots thing slowly growing is the thing that would show that Scotland has totally changed. Now, having said that, it's just not easy to do. And I'm hearing what you're saying. I mean, I wouldn't turn up to stuff. I've got to be really honest. I'm at the moment, I've been finishing a book about huts that's taken me 10 years to finish a PhD and write. All the bits might be chinks towards, you know, the independence argument. But we're in a sort of holding pattern. You know, we're stuck in a holding pattern. And it would take extraordinary, we would already have to have had the structure and have leadership that had arisen from the ranks that was credible and inspiring to be able to pull away at this moment. I mean, we're in a way a bit like Nicola was at the beginning with the British government in COVID. She was, you know, let's just say she was a bit too feared to follow her instincts, and she just repeated their mistakes. And at the moment, we're saying, conscious of what's needed, but just not kind of confident enough to be able to set something up independently and take it off in its own direction. And it's, you know, it's a problem, but that's why I keep raising it, because it gets more of a problem as time goes on, because you know what will happen in the absence of something authentic and grassroots happening. When push finally comes to shove, someone with an ego will set up the Yes campaign again, and it might be fine. It might be okay. It just won't be quite as fandabadozy as if there was something truly different happening. I do remember when ages ago the chap who used to run the Catalan independence movement came over to the Scottish Parliament, and so he came at the beginning and said how envious he was that Scotland had a party and a government that believed in independence. And when he left, he said he wasn't envious of Scotland anymore because having a movement was better. Now, you could argue about that. You know, it's just the way things are. But there is a certain, we are in a certain situation by having, the trade union, the Labour movement party grew out of the trade union movement. The Catalan, Puigdemont and so on, parties grew out of the Catalan movements. But Scottish independence has grown out of a party. And, we are now sitting with all the difficulties of that, because fundamentally we can say whatever we like, but we're not the one person with their hand on the tiller, and that's a situation that we've sort of allowed to exist.
Well, I really agree with you there on that. I think that you have to make a distinction between the leadership of the Yes movement and the Yes movement and the leadership of the SNP. I don't see how the First Minister can be doing essentially three jobs. The day job of being the First Minister, the job of being the leader of the SNP, and then being the sort of putative, supposed leader of the independence movement. Because I really think the independence movement is a much wider thing than the SNP, and I think that's a point of tension at the moment, and I just wondered what you thought about that.
I mean, I've often thought of it from the point of view of a sort of devolved government with as few powers as the Scottish government has is effectively in the game of mitigation. That's all it can do. It just mitigates the crap coming from Westminster. So fundamentally, there's a mitigation head looking at everything, and it would be surprising if you spent so much of your day job that you're employed to do mitigating things to then feel particularly strident and bold about the thing where you have to take different kinds of action. And that's where it would be useful to have a movement that was organised enough to be saying in words of one syllable the kind of stuff and making the sort of arguments that the Scottish government doesn't do. We are where we are. I mean, the time for putting something together perhaps was a little time ago, but I think what happens is people will always do the thing that they feel, comfortable, but people like exercising the skill set they have. So whatever people are kind of good at doing, they kind of like to do more of it. And the Scots are quite, we want to get out there and show stuff. So I think we tend to, and there's nothing wrong with it. I went to Bannockburn, it was great to see everybody. And I, personally speaking, I have that thing. I like to do stuff. I like to be outside. But sometimes what needs to be done is boring inside stuff. It's piecing something together. It's sitting thinking, what 7 people do I know in Edinburgh that I could speak to, gather together and have a really in-depth conversation about setting up a regional Edinburgh Yes thing that's going to do these 3 things. Right, that's difficult, because, which 7 people, who gets to say, hasn't it been tried already? What is it, who's got the money? Who are the bigger people that should be, all that stuff starts. And to what end? What things is it that are so important to do? But the urge, what we'll do instead is things that we're good at doing. This is great. Actually, I'm learning a lot from doing Zoom, so I'm not knocking these at all. These are great. I just wonder, and I'm really the world's worst at this myself, and that's why I spent a bit of the summer contacting people directly and saying, can I meet you to talk about trying to set up a Yes campaign? And I basically got nowhere, which tells me something, that amongst those groups, there isn't the will to set one up, I think. Unless something might change, but just right at the moment, yeah. So that's not a tremendous thing, but I wonder sometimes if it would be worth you thinking strategically about, the fact you've got probably a fair gathering from Edinburgh here, and you'll be thinking, we haven't got many people because there's only 32, right? So on this call. But 32 is about 3 times more than the people who did the Isle of Egg buyout. And it's about 4 times more than the guys who are going to make history in Wanlock Head. All I'm saying, I'm sorry to chuck this back at you, but you know this yourselves. If you're going to act as part of a whole that doesn't exist and hasn't got leadership, then 32 is nothing. But 32 people who've decided to do something themselves and get something going themselves is quite something. There could be that in every part of Scotland. There could be a Zoom call easily every other day in Scotland with 32 people from every airt. But to do what? It needs, I'm not quite sure how to orchestrate that, and it doesn't feel right for me to be doing it. But I merely point out 32 is quite a lot if you were to give yourselves a task.
There is, I spent 5 years ago, a long time trying to set up a regional Yes group, made up of Yes groups. A lot of self-interest came in and it didn't take place. And then suddenly it did take place. Inverness and the North were trying very hard then to get all the regional people together, and so then they can form ahead. And although that's slowly going ahead, it will happen, I think, in the next year. So we might have a national group of Yes groups eventually. But the sticking point you've already mentioned: who heads it, where the money coming from, where with this, that. But I just wish they would just get together and do their own campaigns, but use the national thing to liaise what's going on, But I also think an awful lot of today's frustrations are down to 3 years of horrible Brexit and 6 months of the pandemic. Sometimes the marches used to let our hair down, It doesn't happen anymore. And it shouldn't happen. I mean, we shouldn't be marching in the pandemic. We're supposed to keep our lives safe. But it will happen. Every day now I get people coming in to tell me there were no voters and sceptical Yes voters who are now solid behind the Yes. I don't think we need to worry too much. We just got to get rid of the pandemic. Then, of course, I don't disagree with anything that Lesley said. She's on land reform and everything else was exactly right. But I do think we can be a bit hard on ourselves. I think there's an awful lot going on.
I don't know, we've got this little letter writing campaign going in our little neck of the woods here, and we've managed to get some letters published. We're trying to take the campaign to the unionist press and try and get letters in there, and I don't know, maybe any tips that you can give us as a media person, that would be great.
Well, topical. I was saying this to the All Under One Banner guys, actually in the wake of the 31st of January thing that Mike and I organised outside the Parliament. It was obvious to me that the media were waiting for somebody to put a gig on to come and film that night. Because they had a story, there was an objective story, not run by us on our timescales, whatever, but out there in Reelsville, there was going to be, Britain was leaving on the 31st of January. So, the whole thing about TV is show, don't tell. What they want to have is to show that the Scots didn't want to be taken out of the EU. How do you show that? Well, if you've got a whole big demonstration sitting outside the Scottish Parliament, you go, you actual dancer, right? Because it's all there and you just have to film it. All the things I'm trying to describe, it's just that it's not, if you think backwards, you're trying to think about, fitting in with what the press will want. So, for example, I'm putting you on notice, Mike. They will want, on December the 30th or whatever date it is that we finally go out, they will want a gig somewhere in Scotland to be filming. For example, I could put serious money that whatever we do on the 30th of December, we will get every single TV camera in Britain there from every company. And if you think about it that way, it's more difficult, obviously, when you're doing sort of local things, but you've got to, if you want to kind of get letters in, it's basically always better to try and, instead of kind of just hurtling in, which I'm sure you're not doing, but hurtling in a sort of, and another thing about independence, but more try to grab something that's actually newsworthy, particularly something that's been written about in that paper. It sort of gives them the conceit that you've actually read their paper, which always gives a little flutter to an editor. So if there's a reference even to a piece, then that makes them think, good, they're reading it, and then they're developing something from the story we wrote. Every time you're doing something you think, you've got the problem of engaging a hostile press in your thing. So it's the same with anything in life. You've got to think about where the person is coming from. If you want to, you can, on that thing about you can take a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. We certainly can't make a newspaper editor drink. you need to try to frame it in terms of something that's happening right now. So that's the key thing to do. Look at whatever's the top story running and think about a letter to the paper about that, which finally gets round to your point, about independence.
31st of January, when we had all those people, media people wanting to come and do it, I've had well over 100 calls from them asking me if there's anything else on. So they're looking for news in Scotland.
Well, that's first of all, there's a number of things, because first of all, they've kind of, the fact that you call yourselves Yes Hub is also giving them the idea that you're a hub of all information, which indeed you are. But there's also a thing of there's no other, where else are they going to go? And I've got to say, there has been a wee proposal to set up a sort of media hub that would be a Yes media hub. Never mind all the rest of it. Never mind the democracy and the, hub, pamphlets and all the rest of it. But just to be a media hub. Having said all that, the alternative is just to give more money to the blooming Edinburgh Yes Hub to get on with it. And meanwhile, back at what you're saying, do they just want any old thing to report on? I mean, or they want
most of them, Lesley, were foreign journalists, and they were wanting to know one or two things. Have we got any follow-up about Brexit? Will Scotland basically go into a level of civil disobedience if they're not allowed back into the EU, or do an Northern Ireland deal? And things of that nature. Also, they're looking for rallies and gigs. It's kind of stopped now, since about the June, when really there was a European lockdown. But tremendous amount of interest from France, Spain, and Germany, and one or two radios. I've done about 20 radio interviews recently. I'm getting so blasé about them, I'd only actually record them and listen back on them, But it's just a tremendous interest. And I've not only done them myself, I've passed them on to people, other people to do. There's an awful lot of interest, maybe more interest out with them of the UK than in Scotland,
Mike, do you perceive this as being hostile? Just curious, or
don't get me wrong. We get the hostile ones, but to me, when I get a hostile call or someone hostile come into the hub, I put that down to we're winning. They wouldn't be doing that if we weren't winning, And we are.
Yeah. May I raise something? Ian Lawson had a really good suggestion a few years ago. They had a campaign to make sure that produce in stores was labeled Scottish. Yeah. And I think they had a protest outside of Asda, and they called Asda the Scottish disaster area because they had no Scottish labeled produce. And it changed Asda. They immediately called in and gave contracts worth millions to people in Scotland to provide their fruit and veg and their meat, etc. And what we've noticed, and this is the local Tesco here in Brunsfield, they're starting very quietly to replace the saltire with the Union flag. And I think this could be a very effective way, which is what Ian Lawson was saying, is to revive this campaign. The last time they had the campaign, my friend Janet tells stories of pensioners going to the checkout, and they will be ringing up the groceries, and there'll be something with a Union flag, and they'll say, "Oh, sorry, no, I don't want that." They'll have to put it away and create all this problem for the checkout. But they made the point very clearly, and it was embarrassing to the store. So this is something that I think maybe we should look at again, particularly because London is keen to label everything with the new internal market and to eviscerate Scotland and the Scottish Parliament and the powers that we have to do things differently. I think this could be a good way to get the attention of a lot of people.
It's a good idea. Can I say that the co-op has a policy now of labelling everything with the Union Jack? And I have written to them many a time, and also try to arrange people to do the old checkout trick.
Okay, but folks, let's not reinvent the wheel on this, because there's a woman called Ruth Watson, who was a producer on my old programme, who set up Scotland the Brand. She lives in Kirriemuir, and so it's her that did the campaign, that did the donkey work, and she's created contacts with all the sort of food producers. I mean, she's really done an incredible job. But this is what I mean about trying to kind of, like, let's just concentrate on this for a minute, because this is a good idea. I mean, Mike's contributed that the foreign press particularly are interested in something. Leah's saying, yeah, that's happening. We're all beginning to notice it, aren't we? The Union Jacks coming in on everything. I know Ruth very well, actually, so I can undertake after this to get in touch with her and say, could we think of something to do? And then we need to think of what to do. You know, there's part of it is to get the substance of finding out just quite how much stuff. It's not just our imagination. You know, it is beginning to change because of this internal market thing. The second thing is trying to think about what to do about it. And you could take it to the checkouts. It causes hassle. But, I mean, somehow it feels like you want to be letting the people around the store. And, you know, you want us to be outside the store, basically, having some very succinct message that we've really thought through so that it's right. And then that's at a local level, but actually that's not necessarily totally what the foreign journalists want. I mean, some of them would be quite happy to come. There was 2 foreign journalists interviewed me at Bannockburn. But what you could have is outside the Scottish Parliament is a pile from all the different supermarkets that have got Union Jacks on stuff that used to have, that comes from Scotland, and just make it be a very visible thing, a food mountain, you know, a Union Jack food mountain of all the stuff that's basically changing. You just need to make sure we've got the arguments right, you know, about our objection to it. But Ruth will have that. She spent years on this, you know. It's just that she's sitting in Kirriemuir not having this conversation, and she's not got the feeling that there's lots of people that are keen to do something, you know, whereas we're sitting thinking, oh, I wish we knew all this stuff. She's got that. Maybe we should put that together.
I think that's a great idea.
Right, can I intervene then? Lesley, if you do that and contact me, I'll organise it.
Sorry, what I was going to say is it's really important that we get from you now, really important, the ups and downs of this. Like, if that doesn't float your boat, then say it, right? If it sounds like it's a bit wide of the mark and what's it got to do with independence, there's, you know, it's a bit not too sure, please feel you can say, because this is the beginning of not doing things like is normally done, where 3 people kind of get carried away with themselves and the rest go, let them do it.
What about having a sort of demonstration or something outside this new civil service office that they've got, you know, in Edinburgh? It's at Queen Elizabeth House, they're calling it. You know, that's where Alistair Jack and his 3,000 civil servants are going to be. I'm not really quite sure what the function of that building is, but there was a photograph the other day. They had Alistair Jack and 2 other guys. One of this guy from Milton Keynes, it's supposedly his sidekick. I think is he called Ian Stewart or something like that, and I think Douglas Ross. And that's a huge, big, wide open space. It's right next to Waverley Station, i.e. really easy to get to for people coming that way. And right next to where the council building are, you know, the planning office, the main part down there.
I think that would be something that I would certainly be interested in being involved in. And I think there's a history to the fact that the bus station and the Bongo Club and all of that was knocked down there as the Mount Grange development plan, which was a really insidious and unpleasant bit of illegal planning that was forced through by development people and addressing the kind of corruption in the local authority and lack of democracy about the whole thing. I think that's another thing that would make it very easy to mobilise a lot of people around doing something there. And it's very iconic.
The supermarket idea, that's something that could go across the entire country, though. Queen Elizabeth House is just in Edinburgh. If you wanted to get a movement where everyone could take part and do something and shine the spotlight on what's happening to Scotland, the brand, which is what Ruth Watson, you're quite right, created, I think this could be a very good time to energize a lot of people around Scotland.
I have contact with all the Yes groups, so that's not a problem.
And the thing that perhaps I'm increasingly thinking that this idea of having a media hub might actually be quite a good one is that at different times, if you spend your life steeped in the media, as I now do, you know, there'll be a day where, for example, there'll be something about defence or Trident will come up, the cost of Trident they'll have to make, let's just say for the sake of argument, There's another point where they have to commit to a certain amount of money. The nurses come in and say that equals 10,000 million nurses getting the pay rise that they want. That's how you use something then, so that, until the Trident thing's moving, my point I'm trying to make is that at any one time, I always think of it like a horse galloping through the landscape. That's what news is. It's the horse that's galloping through the landscape. It's the thing that's moving. You look at it because it's moving. And the easiest way to get somewhere is to jump on the horse. Not go and find yourself another old cuddy sort of sitting in a field that's nibbling at a piece of grass. Jump on the horse that's moving. So that's not everybody's boat. I quite appreciate that. But that's why I'm trying to say that for those of us who've spent a lot of time in the media, that's how you get things out there. And it'll be different according to what's actually happening. So, a skill is, there are days and there are news events that are just so predictable. And for some reason, the SNP never puts anything on when any of these predictable events are on the go. So it might be that there's a kind of case for somebody just sitting there trying to sort of come up with ideas that look like they're kind of relating to what's already in the news, because those are the things that will get coverage. And the point that I'm trying to make is that you'll bang your heads against a brick wall, as single issue campaigners or any kind of campaigners, and perhaps it's just par for the course, but you'll be trying to get something over until one day it happens to already be in the news, and bingo, you're on it.
Yeah.
So it could be the day that the 4 big supermarkets have something in the news. It's hard to say, and you can't get hung up with it because you can't live your whole life waiting to see what headline crops up. But it's astonishing how much more traction you get when you're saying something you believe in and you're harnessing it to an event the public already thinks is important. That's all. So anyway, I'll get in touch with Ruth, which is something I know I can do, and get back to Mike. Does anybody, I know I haven't explained it particularly, but does anybody think there would be a role for having a sort of media hub that just deals constantly with press inquiries and just tries to kind of turn stuff around and get angles up and stuff?
Yeah, I'm certainly with that one.
Totally.
Yeah, it's an experienced media person doing it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well that's very interesting. I'll feed that back to him then.
It'd also be good if such a centre or person running it is able to therefore feed out how to make your events and your activities media friendly. Because of the things you say, you want to feed the media in the way that they want to be fed, because that's how you get things out there. So having that as a resource to help do that.
Well, I've often said I'm quite happy to do any little thingies, that takes people through this, but relatively few people have kind of taken me up on that, but I'm quite happy to do that. I've only subliminally noticed a few headlines because I've been trying to get the final bits of this Huts book thing finished. But I noticed, was it Michael Gove or somebody came up about the method of voting? Because I noticed Mike Russell had a very stinging little rebuke on Twitter today about the methods of voting. Michael Gove said something.
George Galloway suggesting that Scots in England should be able to vote in a referendum, and then Michael Gove says, yes, interesting idea.
Just to try and demonstrate what I'm saying, there's quite a few of you knew that story, and I hadn't even got it, but it's interesting, right? So it's caught your attention, right? Anybody who feeds anything into that story will catch other people's attention because it's already worked. It's already got a hook into your attention. So then you just get a hook into it, and for example, it isn't perfect, actually, it's not what I thought it was, but there might be a position for English Scots for Yes, to sort of, be the ones who come up and say, look, can we just clarify this on behalf of English people living in Scotland? We're delighted to live in a country that actually it's more important where you live and work than where you used to be. Right, now that would not make any headline yesterday, but as soon as George Galloway's come out and then Michael Gove's punted it on, you've got a potential, you of all people, as English Scots for Yes, have got something to say that sits in that story. And everybody who's here that's got a particular sort of niche or something has got a moment where they're going to be exactly the right ones to speak. I'm quite happy to try and coach all of you guys to think the way that I do after 30 years in the business. In fact, there's a wheeze. you could get all your English Scots for Independence to go in and just do, I was born in Watford, I was born in Walsall, and I'm delighted that I'm living here, because it doesn't matter where you started, it matters where you've chosen to live. Can you imagine how cheery that would be? Everybody doing it. And the other thing to say is, those kind of tweets are always work well, because it's people owning their own experience. That's why Mike Russell wrote, I come from Shrewsbury, and I'm quite chuffed to be in Scotland, because it doesn't matter where you come from, it matters where you live. I guess he'll do that tonight. Have a bit of fun with it. Get a hashtag, get going.
Lesley, thank you very much. It's been great. I'm sure people can put the thumbs up and show you how wonderful you are. There you go. You are loved.
I'm launching this book about huts, which is basically also about our dispossession from nature. On the 10th of September, we've just agreed that, and Andy Whiteman's going to be doing a sort of conversation with me about it. So there'll be a thing coming out everywhere, but it's going to be 10th of September, on something Zoomy. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
And that was Lesley Riddoch at the Edinburgh Yes Hub. Join us next time for another Yes Group Spotlight.
Indylive.radio.